In the Middle East conflict, South Africa is expected to go back to the International Criminal Court of Justice to present more evidence on its genocide case against Israel in the war in Gaza. Pretoria says it will present what it says are new facts of Israel's targeting of civilians at schools, hospitals and mosques in Gaza. For more on this, let's now bring in Dr. Atilla Kisla, who is International Justice Cluster Lead from the Southern Africa Litigation Center. Dr. Kisla, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. Let's start off here. What's the understanding about what it is that South Africa will be presenting before the ICJ today, and how different is it from the three other presentations that have taken place?
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me, firstly. So what South Africa will submit today will be its main submissions for the main case here at the International Court of Justice. And like you said, they are going to focus on these various areas of violations of international law. And in order to prove that Israel has violated key provisions of the Genocide Convention. And in that regard, South Africa will have to prove, for instance, that Israel acted, or the responsible authorities acted, with genocidal intent. Previously, we have seen in the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice that the court sets a very high bar to that kind of standard, to a standard for proving genocidal intent. So it will be, we will have to wait and see how strong South Africa's submissions are, and how the court will perceive them.
Yeah, and considering the previous orders also that have been handed down by the ICJ, which has brought me to this particular question around how this case has also brought into sharp focus the powers of the ICJ, and evidently it seems that those powers are quite limited if you take into consideration that in May the court issued new orders instructing Israel to, quote, immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict the Palestinian group in Gaza's condition of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And at the core of the genocide case is that in whole or in part.
Exactly. Like you said, there have been 3 provisional measures issued by the court this year, in January, March, and May. As this case has shown, it has highlighted the limitations of the court as an institution to ensure adherence to international law. Then again, the ICJ has not been designed to be an enforcement authority, so it doesn't have these kind of powers to enforce its own decisions. It's always up to the states to enforce those decisions by the International Court of Justice. If the international community or states would like to change that, it's up to the international community and states actually to bring such an initiative. I still think that even though Israel is not adhering to the provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice, that those provisional measures were important, and in order to inform public opinion, but also to support the international community or other states' initiatives, whether it's at the UN General Assembly or other institutions. So it certainly had an impact outside this case, especially if we look also to proceedings at the International Criminal Court.
Yeah, and I think the other part that has been raised, even in that initial application that was brought before the ICJ, is the argument that when it comes to matters that the ICJ deals with, it is a state to state or state versus state. But in this particular conflict, it is a state versus, according to Israel, their focus is on Hamas, and therefore the court itself can't necessarily issue an order against Hamas.
Exactly. Hamas is not a state, and that's why the court cannot really make any orders in relation to that kind of entity. Like I said, the International Court of Justice is concerned about states and their obligations and where they violate their obligations under international law. So the court in that regard is limited, and in this case, it's further limited to the provisions of the Genocide Convention, and where those provisions on the Genocide Convention have been breached.
Yeah. Does South Africa's case become any stronger before the ICJ, considering a warrant of arrest, when you look at the ICC's investigation, looking at the International Criminal Court's own investigation around allegations of war crimes against Israel and also against Hamas?
I think it certainly plays into the proceedings at the International Criminal Court. What we have seen at the International Court of Justice, where that's the provisional measures or submissions that South Africa made, I think they will all be relevant for the case at the International Criminal Court, and the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, I'm sure, will be watching, observing South Africa's submissions in very detailed, because it will be relevant or might be relevant also for the International Criminal Court when it, later on at a later stage decides to charge responsible perpetrators of the crime of genocide. Right now, as you know, it has only charged the responsible persons for crimes against humanity and war crimes.
Yeah. The other part around this is looking at the non-actors in this particular case, but certainly very linked to it. The United States, they're going through an election currently, and what this means for the United States' relationship with Israel, but also their own condemnation around the approach that has been taken by Israel. But then on the other part as well, the United Nations and its chief, Antonio Guterres, being banned from going to Israel.
Exactly. I mean, that shows also, especially if we look at states like the US or other states that are supporting, for instance, Israel with weapons or arms and supported in any other way, there's like a hypocrisy or a double standard, if you want, that applies here. That states, even though they might speak out on human rights and adherence to international law, at the end of the day, they still support Israel, for instance, with necessary arms or weapons in that regard. So I think that's why, like, this case has highlighted a lot of double standards, not only on the side of Israel and its allies, but it will also be relevant for other states which will be measured on their position in this matter.
Yeah, and finally, while you have all of this happening with the court case and the non-actors specifically to the court case, is the other element around negotiations for a peace deal and a ceasefire. Is that still possible where we're currently standing? Egypt, Saudi Arabia has tried. Do you think that it's still possible, or is it all up to what the court is eventually going to decide and how the United Nations and its Security Council will respond to that?
I hope that it's still on the table, the peace deal is still on the table, because, as you know, the proceedings at the International Court of Justice are not very quick or known to be quick. So once South Africa has filed, for instance, their submissions today, I think, I'm not sure about the exact date, but Israel will most likely have till sometime next year to file their submissions, and then it will only move to the hearing stage some time later. So this can still, at the ICJ, can take years. So one shouldn't bank on the decision or outcome from the ICJ to negotiate a peace deal in this context.
Yeah, and we know so far around over 42,000 people have been killed in Palestine, just over 1,000 in Israel as this conflict rages on. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Atilla Kisla there, International Justice Cluster Lead, joining us ahead of South Africa's case before the ICJ